Hollywood Hills, 1957. Joseph Mankiewicz mansion. Gene Kelly stood in the main ballroom, scotch in hand, holding court with a group of younger actors. He'd been talking about dance for 20 minutes. The craft of it, the discipline, the years of training required to truly master it. Someone mentioned Dean Martin's name, said Dean was a great entertainer. And Gene said it. Dean's a wonderful singer, but he can't dance. Not really. Singers move, but they don't dance. There's a difference. The group around Gene nodded politely, but one of them glanced across the room nervously, because Dean Martin was standing about 15 feet away at the bar, and he just turned his head slightly. He'd heard every word. Frank Sinatra saw it happening before anyone else. He was sitting in a corner booth with Sammy Davis Jr., and he watched Dean's body language change. The way Dean set down his drink a little harder than necessary. The way his jaw tightened for just a second. "Oh no," Frank said quietly. "What?" Sammy looked up. Gene just said Dean can't dance, and Dean heard him. Sammy's eyes went wide. Is Gene drunk? Not drunk enough to have an excuse for this. They watched as Dean Martin pushed off from the bar and walked toward Gene Kelly. The crowd between them parted instinctively, sensing something was about to happen. Dean stopped about 5 feet from Gene. "Gene," Dean said, his voice calm, friendly even, that trademark Dean Martin smoothness. "I heard you talking about dancing." Gene turned, realized who was behind him, and his face went slightly red. But he was too proud to back down. "Dean, we were discussing the craft of dance, technical stuff, nothing personal." No, Dean said, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. "I heard you say singers can't dance. I want to make sure I heard that right." The ballroom was getting quieter, conversations stopping, heads turning. "Well," Gene said, trying to laugh it off, "I mean, obviously singers can move, but trained dance, real choreography, that takes years of discipline that most singers don't have. You understand?" Dean took a drag from his cigarette, smiled. "I understand you think I can't dance." Gene's face went from red to pale. He'd just insulted Dean Martin in front of half of Hollywood, and there was no way to take it back. "Dean, I didn't mean—" That's when Gene made his biggest mistake of the night. Instead of apologizing, instead of backing down, his ego kicked in. "Okay, fine. You want to prove me wrong? I'll bet you $10,000 you can't dance for 2 minutes without embarrassing yourself. Real dancing, not just swaying to music." The room went completely silent. Dean looked at Gene for a long moment. Then he turned to Joseph Mankiewicz, who was standing nearby, looking horrified. "Joe, you're a witness. Gene just bet me $10,000. "Dean, you don't have to," Joe started. Dean turned back to Gene. "Make it 20,000. Gene blinked. "What?" "You heard me. $20,000, and let's see who's embarrassed." Frank Sinatra stood up from his booth. "Gene, don't do this." Humphrey Bogart walked over. "Dean, you don't need to prove anything to this kid." But Gene Kelly's pride was fully engaged now. He was the greatest dancer in Hollywood. There was no way Dean Martin, a singer who'd taken maybe a few dance lessons in his life, was going to show him up. "Fine," Gene said, extending his hand. $20,000, 2 minutes. The band plays whatever they want. You dance. I judge whether it's real dancing or just moving around." Dean shook his hand. "One change," Dean said. "Not just you judging. Everyone here votes. Simple majority. Does Dean Martin know how to dance? Yes or no?" Gene hesitated, then nodded.
Fine, majority vote. Dean stubbed out his cigarette in a nearby ashtray. Let's do this now before you sober up and realize what a stupid bet this is. Act 1. Who were Gene Kelly and Dean Martin? To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Gene Kelly and Dean Martin were in 1957. Gene Kelly was 45 years old and at the absolute peak of his career. Singin' in the Rain had come out 5 years earlier and was already being called one of the greatest films ever made. Gene wasn't just a dancer, he was the dancer. Athletic, innovative, masculine in a way that made dance acceptable for men who'd grown up thinking it was soft. Gene had trained since he was 8 years old, ballet, tap, modern dance. He'd opened his own dance studio at 15. He'd choreographed Broadway shows. He'd revolutionized how dance looked on film. Everything Gene Kelly did was precise, calculated, perfect. He was also, if we're being honest, a bit of a perfectionist. The kind of guy who'd make dancers rehearse for 18 hours straight until they got a routine exactly right. The kind of guy who believed that greatness came from discipline, training, and relentless practice. Gene Kelly had earned every bit of his success through sweat and work. Dean Martin was 40 years old and on a completely different trajectory. He'd just ended his partnership with Jerry Lewis a year earlier. Everyone in Hollywood had predicted Dean would disappear without Jerry. They'd been wrong, dead wrong.
Dean had just released 10,000 Bedrooms, proving he could carry a movie alone. His recording career was exploding. His nightclub act in Vegas was the hottest ticket in town. And he'd just been cast in The Young Lions, a serious, dramatic role that would shock everyone who thought he was just a comedy singer. But Dean's approach to entertainment was the opposite of Gene's. Dean made everything look effortless. He'd show up, hit his marks, nail his songs in one take, and go home. He didn't rehearse, he didn't prepare, he just did it. People who didn't know better thought Dean was lazy. People who worked with him knew different. Dean's effortlessness was its own kind of discipline. He just made it look easy. Act 2. The Challenge. The band had been playing background music all night, but now they stopped. The band leader, Tommy Dorsey Jr., stood up nervously. "What are we playing?" he asked. Dean walked over to him, whispered something in his ear. Tommy nodded, turned to his band. "The Way You Look Tonight, medium swing tempo." A good song, not too fast, not too slow, a classic that everyone knew. Gene Kelly walked to the side of the ballroom, arms crossed, confident smile on his face. He was already thinking about what he'd do with the $20,000. Dean Martin stood in the center of the dance floor. He took off his tuxedo jacket, handed it to a passing waiter, loosened his tie. The room was packed now. 150 people forming a circle around the dance floor, everyone wanting to see this. Frank Sinatra leaned over to Sammy Davis Jr. "What do you think?" Sammy whispered back, "I think Gene's about to learn something." Act 3. The Dance That Changed Everything. The band started playing, soft at first, then building. Dean Martin didn't move for the first 4 bars. He just stood there, eyes closed, feeling the music. Some people in the crowd started to whisper. Was he nervous? Did he not know what to do? Then on the 5th bar, Dean started to move, and everything changed. Dean Martin didn't dance like Gene Kelly. He didn't do pirouettes or leaps or complicated footwork. What Dean did was something entirely different. He moved like water. Smooth, effortless, natural. Every step perfectly in time with the music, but not in a way that looked rehearsed, in a way that looked like he was born moving to that rhythm. His shoulders rolled with the beat. His feet slid across the floor in simple steps that somehow looked cooler than any complicated routine. His hands moved in small, precise gestures that emphasized the music without calling attention to themselves. But the real magic was his face. Dean smiled, not a performance smile, a genuine smile, like he was having the best time of his life. Like dancing wasn't work, it was joy. Gene Kelly's confident smile started to fade. Because what Dean was doing wasn't technically perfect. His form wasn't classical. His footwork wasn't complex, but it didn't matter. Dean Martin had style. He made it look not just easy, but like the most natural thing in the world, like anyone could do it, like music and movement were the same thing. The crowd started to sway with him. Some people started snapping their fingers. The energy in the room shifted from watching a competition to experiencing something. Dean spun once, casual, smooth, ended up facing Gene Kelly directly, and he winked. The crowd laughed. The tension broke. This wasn't a competition anymore. This was Dean Martin showing everyone what his kind of dancing looked like. 1 minute 30 seconds in, Dean caught the eye of a young actress named Pier Angeli standing near the edge of the dance floor. He extended his hand. She blushed, took it. Dean pulled her onto the floor and danced with her for the last 30 seconds of the song. And he made her look like a great dancer too, because that's what Dean did. He made everyone around him look better. When the song ended, Dean dipped Pier, held it for 2 beats, then brought her back up. He kissed her hand, thanked her quietly, and she practically floated back to the edge of the crowd. Dean Martin turned to face the room. He wasn't even breathing hard. The ballroom exploded. People were applauding, cheering, laughing, not because Dean had done something technically impressive, because he'd done something that made them feel good. The applause lasted for almost a minute. Dean stood there, modest, a little embarrassed actually. He picked up his jacket, started to put it back on. Gene Kelly hadn't moved from his spot. He was still standing with his arms crossed, but his face had changed. The smugness was gone. Act 4. I was wrong. Joseph Mankiewicz cleared his throat loudly. Okay, everyone, the bet was, does Dean Martin know how to dance? Majority vote. All in favor of yes, raise your hand. Every single hand in the room went up. All 150 people. Gene looked around, slowly lowered his arms. Dean walked over to him.
Gene, you don't actually have to pay me. That was just talk. But Gene Kelly shook his head. He was a lot of things. Perfectionist, demanding, sometimes arrogant, but he wasn't a welcher. No, a bet's a bet. He paused. And I was wrong. Those 3 words, I was wrong, from Gene Kelly, were rarer than rain in the desert. Wrong about what? Dean asked quietly. Gene looked at him directly. I thought dancing was about technique, training, perfect form, all the things I worked my whole life to master. He glanced at the dance floor where Dean had just performed. But what you just did, that wasn't about technique. That was about feeling, connection, making people feel something. Dean lit another cigarette. Gene, what you do is incredible. I couldn't do what you do in a million years. The athleticism, the precision, the choreography, that takes a gift I don't have. But you have a different gift, Gene said. You make it look like anyone could do it, like it's not work, like it's just being yourself. Dean smiled. It is just being myself. That's all I know how to do. Gene extended his hand. I'll write you a check tomorrow. Dean shook his head. Keep your money, but maybe buy me a drink sometime and we'll call it even. Gene Kelly smiled for the first time since the bet started. Deal.
Act 5. The Aftermath and Respect. Frank Sinatra told that story for the next 40 years. Every time someone would ask him about Dean Martin, Frank would say, "Let me tell you about the night Dean took $20,000 off Gene Kelly without even trying." The story spread through Hollywood like wildfire. Not through newspapers, this was an era before TMZ and social media, but through word of mouth, the way all the best Hollywood stories spread. Directors who'd worked with both men would compare them. Gene Kelly makes you better through discipline. Dean Martin makes you better by making you relax. Gene shows you what greatness looks like when you work for it. Dean shows you what greatness looks like when you just are it. Gene Kelly never badmouthed Dean Martin again. In fact, in interviews years later, Gene would bring up that night himself. "Dean Martin taught me something important," Gene said in a 1978 interview. "I'd spent my whole life believing that artistry required suffering, discipline, endless practice. And it does for some people, for me. But Dean showed me there's another path, the path of natural talent, making it look easy, connecting with people instead of impressing them." The interviewer asked, "Which path is better?" Gene smiled. "That's the point. Neither. Both. They're just different. I made people say, 'Wow.' Dean made people say, 'I could do that.' Both have value. Took me 45 years and one humiliating bet to figure that out." Dean Martin, for his part, never bragged about it. When people would bring it up, he'd just shrug and say, "Gene's a hell of a dancer, best there ever was. We just dance different." But here's the interesting thing. After that night, Gene Kelly's approach to directing changed, slightly, not dramatically, but slightly. He started giving actors more freedom, started trusting instinct a little more than technique, started understanding that there was more than one way to be great. And Dean? Dean kept being Dean, effortless, smooth, making it look easy. They never became close friends. Their personalities were too different, but they respected each other. And in Hollywood, where egos clash constantly, mutual respect is rarer and more valuable than friendship. Epilogue: Two Kinds of Greatness. Gene Kelly died in 1996 at the age of 83. At his funeral, dancers from around the world paid tribute to his technical genius, his innovation, his perfectionism that pushed the art form forward. Dean Martin died in 1995 at the age of 78. At his funeral, there were no dance numbers, just people telling stories about how Dean made them feel, how he made everything seem possible, how he proved you could be great without looking like you were trying. Two men, two kinds of greatness, two different paths to the same place, legendary status. The story of their dance-off lives on because it teaches something important, something we all need to hear. There's more than one way to be great. Gene Kelly's way, discipline, training, perfection, is valid, beautiful, important. Dean Martin's way, natural talent, effortless style, connection, is equally valid, beautiful, important. We spend so much time arguing about which path is better that we forget they're both paths to the same destination. Gene Kelly made you believe dance was an art form that required dedication and could achieve perfection. Dean Martin made you believe dance was something anyone could do if they just relaxed and felt the music. Both lessons are true. Both men were right. And that night in 1957, when Dean Martin danced for 2 minutes and won $20,000 he never collected, wasn't about one man beating another. It was about two kinds of greatness meeting, clashing, and finally recognizing each other. Gene Kelly was wrong about Dean Martin, but more importantly, he was brave enough to admit it. And Dean Martin was gracious enough to accept that admission without rubbing it in. That's the real story. Not about who was the better dancer, about who was the better man.